The forests are quiet and full of terror. This is Darkness Prevails, the best place to share your true scary stories with the world, because this world is a strange one. You fall asleep every night in your cozy bed and thick walls, but what would you do if you woke up in the middle of the woods? How would you react? Would you even get out alive? Well, these allegedly true stories show us what might be waiting in the woods, or warning us to stay away. Remember, you can share your true stories with us using the links in the description. Also, check out morbidmonsters.com and think about representing the channel by buying a t-shirt. Every t-shirt sold supports us. Real quick, here are the first 5 interesting comments from my previous video. Ikar1 says, I got this notification while in Mexico. Considering the video was about scary stories from Mexico, I wonder how quickly you jumped on a plane after hearing those stories. Kane75 says, Chupacabra. Honestly, I'm kinda disappointed that I didn't get a Chupacabra story. That's even what I put on the thumbnail. I love those things. Ya boy worries me quite a bit when he says, yes, ghosts can have my babies. Sounds like a new horror movie. Guillermo del Toro directs Ghost Baby. I'd watch it. Leilani Tezuka says, I don't need coffee when I have your stories to keep me awake. I know, right? Coffee and these stories do 2 things to me. Keep me awake and make me use the bathroom. And Taxi Confession says, do you ever think about making a true mother-in-law horror stories video? Hey, if you want me to read Cinderella to you guys, just say so. And yes, I'd love to do that video topic. Now, let's get lost in the woods and never come back. Number 1. 11 Days at Cadet Camp. Submitted by JRG962. This was something that happened to me when I was 10 years old. I was living in a market town in mid-Wales when this occurred. To give a bit of backstory, I'd been living in mid-Wales since 2001, but moved back to England in 2011, so 10 years was how long I lived there. It was a market town between Welshpool and Barmouth. I was in the cadets in Wales, and in 2007, there was a trip to Portsmouth, which is the only island city in the United Kingdom. I was at an encampment, which was around 20 miles from Portsmouth, where I, along with the other cadets, were put in dorms, and there were about 10 of us in these 2-story buildings, and around us were forests. My bed was a camp bed, with a small metal cabinet and a small but very old slide table. And then there were 2 other cadets on either side of me. We did the usual exercises you do as a cadet. For example, we did a full 2-hour march, and we stood at attention. Then afterwards, we grabbed our lunch from this very small and run-down hut, which was mostly always overcrowded, and you were only allowed to eat around the area of the hut, which kind of annoyed me as I like to keep to myself. Now, here's where strange things started to happen. I was out in the middle of the woods with some cadets and our assigned drill sergeant, and we were told to learn about cover and hide, which is sort of the equivalent of being taught how to set up an ambush and where to either hide or find appropriate cover. I was briefly lost after everyone split up. When I was attempting to hide, I heard twigs snapping, and right away I thought it was one of the other cadets on my team, or perhaps the opponents we were to ambush. But when I looked, there was nobody there. I brushed it off as being probably a deer or small animal that ran away. This area was quite rural, trees everywhere. The wildlife was green and overtook the land. I went back to trying to find a place to hide before the opposing team saw me and I ruined everything. But then again, I heard the noise. This time it was closer than before. I looked again, but I still saw nothing, although this was during the early afternoon, so it was broad daylight. I should have been able to see what was making the noise. I was starting to get curious and freaked out, which caused me to be a little less stealthy and run back to where the place of meeting was, only to ruin the activity. The other cadets were annoyed at me, and I told my assigned drill sergeant about what happened and what I heard. But of course he brushed it off as my imagination. Well, what did I expect? Kids that age can have very active imaginations. After that, we were then told we were setting up camp for the night, and I was a little more comfortable knowing people were around. I was told who I was camping with, and it was a couple of other boys from other cadet units. On that night, we were being given a lesson on the way the army set up camps in the woods when they're in the middle of a battlefield and for recon as well. I happened to glance off into the distance at the forest. Under the dimly lit moonlight, the trees and the grass and everything, it looked like it was something from a painting. I wasn't paying attention to anything else. I could barely hear the lieutenant talking to us, trying to teach us new things. I was so distracted. That's when I saw the outline of a shadowy figure walking across the grass from one side of the forest to the other. At first, I thought it was probably a reflection off the trees and the moon, but it was in the form of a silhouette of a man. He looked towards me even, and in a sort of low, echoing voice, the silhouette spoke to me, or called to me. "When you die, you will burn in hell." My eyes widened so far, it felt like my skin was going to rip. I couldn't breathe. What I was seeing and hearing was so terrifying. I thought I was living a nightmare. I trembled and gasped, causing one of the sergeants to look at me and saw me looking out of the camp. She came over to me, worried, and asked me if I was all right. Now, I was a quiet and sensitive child. I could get upset fairly easily. Out of the sight of the other cadets, I was weeping my eyes out as I was overcome with emotion and fear. But I was able to make it through the rest of the lesson. Afterwards, I found my dad and spoke to him, and he told me I was just being overreactive, that I needed to calm down and think about what I thought I saw. But I couldn't. I told him I wanted to just go home, but I had missed that opportunity. A former friend of mine went home earlier with his mom. They lived in the same region, and I could have hitched a ride. But now I was stuck here for the 11-day stay. 2 days later, there was a party in the hall of the complex, and I was there for a couple of hours, as it wasn't really a disco party with a DJ and a bar, just a drink stand and a CD player hooked up to speakers, playing some new albums. I then headed back alone to the dorm I was sleeping in, while the others were at the party or around the complex having a good time. My dorm was on the other side of the complex, and I knew I had a walk ahead of me. As I headed back towards my dorm, I saw a woman in a cadet uniform looking away from me near the girls-only dorms. I asked her if she was all right, to which she replied to me in a similar, echoey sort of voice. "You shouldn't be here." And if that wasn't enough to scare me out of my mind again, that's when I saw it. Her bottom half was almost entirely invisible, transparent, see-through. I started to panic, freaking out, making a run back to the door, pounding at it, until finally a cadet who I spoke to let me in, and I went straight to the dorm, staying there the entire night. I didn't catch any sleep that night. Can you blame me? It was the 10th day, and the final night before I went back to Mid-Wales. I was relieved and decided to make this day count as it was my last day. That day was fairly relaxed, like a reward ceremony and a raft trip, including canoeing and rock climbing. The day flew by, and it was almost night. I walked back to my dorm feeling happy it was the last day, and that everything went by much more smoothly and less horrifying. When I got back to the dorms, I saw that the other kids, to my dismay, were having a go at a Ouija board session, and they even invited me along, which of course I said no. I've had enough of strange things happening, no thank you. So instead I just went to sleep. Over 2 hours later, after falling asleep, I awoke to the noise of footsteps on the wooden floor and tapping on the walls, which I thought was the other dorm being in a wind-up mood, as they had shockingly shared a spliff although they were between 12 and 14 years old. So it wouldn't have been a surprise if they were making all that noise. But when the noises just kept going, I looked outside the door only to see the door closed, so they were in bed as well. It made my heart skip a beat, but I decided not to overthink it. The trip was almost over. I just needed to go back to bed. But half an hour later, the noises started again, only this time, it was inside the dorm I was sleeping in. I was hoping it was one of the cadets, but apart from me and 2 other cadets who were sleeping, the beds were vacant, and nobody was moving around, at least not us cadets. The room got cold, freezing cold. At a certain point, I could see my breath. I was frightened, as the windows were locked and could only open with a key. I looked up at the door after feeling like my legs were frozen, planning an escape in case anything weird happened. But it was then that I saw something. In the right corner of the ajar door was the upper half of a man looking in at us, with nothing but the shape of his upper torso and his head. He looked at me, and I whispered over to the other cadet next to me, asking if he could see it too. But like the other ones before, he brushed it off, saying that I was just seeing things. I thought it was pretty ironic, or coincidental, that I saw something that night in my own dorm when they had just finished playing with a Ouija board. The entity just stared at me, and then soon vanished into the darkness. I did not sleep that night, but when the sun came up, I knew it was time to go home, and I couldn't be happier. All the cadets said goodbye to one another, including a few who tried to photograph me, but I hated my picture being taken like that, so I didn't really give them a reply. Anyway, after our goodbyes, the coach left Portsmouth, and I went back home. Now, looking back at those 11 days at that encampment, I can only think of one thing, and that's why. Why would it tell me that I was going to burn in hell? What was the meaning behind those occurrences? And why was I the only one who saw them and heard? Nothing has happened since, but those 11 days are days that hell came to me. Number 2. The Old Choptank Ghost, submitted by Sarah N. Maryland is full of strange stories, myths, and legends, but one of the most culturally important facts of my state is you can't throw a rock without hitting something that is haunted. I grew up on the eastern shore in Caroline County, which meant I spent a lot of time running around the woods and on, in, or near the Choptank River. Looking back on it, that river was filthy and dangerous, and the fact that I nor any of my friends got ill or drowned is a miracle in and of itself. Regardless, I remember the first time I went to my best friend's grandma's and was blown away by her beautiful home right on the river, nestled in the woods. It was gorgeous. It was just outside of town and was near enough to Denton that we could always find some trouble to get into. Unfortunately for us, trouble was a lot closer than we had anticipated. One night in the early fall, I decided to spend the night with a new friend of mine who would eventually become like a sister to me. Her name was Victoria. Victoria lived with her grandmother, and it wasn't until after graduation that we had become very close. The minute I first stepped onto their property, I was blown away by it. Its beauty distracted me initially from the sense of being watched that seemed to intensify the closer night came. The afternoon wore on like any other. We watched movies, talked about colleges, and stuffed our faces with snacks. But as night began to fall, Victoria looked at me and said, "Hey, bet you didn't know the woods around this house are haunted." "Really?" I asked, looking nervously out the kitchen window. At this time, I was already intrigued by the woods, but the aspect of the possible paranormal activity, it just made me more excited and nervous. I've had strange encounters in the woods before, so at the time, I had a strangely apprehensive love of the forest. "Yeah, they say you can hear drums being played, and that sometimes you'll see Indians running around," she said. "Want to go for a walk out there?" I looked up at the sky and noticed that it was just about fully dark out, so hopped up on pixie sticks, soda, and a stupid false bravado. I cheekily laughed and asked her where they kept the flashlights. Once we managed to find a working flashlight, we set out on our adventure. Off in the distance, we could hear the marching band practicing across the river at the high school. With a smile, I mentioned that the band could be the source of those drums she was talking about, or it could just be the cars going over the bridge a mile down the river. Victoria shrugged and looked at me strangely as we entered the woods. Confused, I wrote it off, and I followed her. The difference between the tail end of sunset in the yard and the nearly impenetrable darkness under the trees was unlike anything I'd ever seen before. Worried, I kept close to my friend as we walked in deeper. As we walked, I found out things about her that she hadn't told anyone else, most of which was private, but as we exchanged secrets, I noticed movement in the dark. Every time I looked, whatever it was would be gone. At this point, I was nervous but excited. I pointed it out to Victoria, who said she was seeing it as well. We pressed farther in when I began to hear something. It was a strange thud-like sound that boomed in the distance. I listened, trying to hear the rest of the band, but other than the distant booming noise, the woods were eerily silent. I looked at Victoria, who kept looking around even more nervously than before. Finally, I asked her, "What's wrong?" She looked at me for a moment in surprise, like she had forgotten I was with her. Before she could open her mouth to speak, everything went completely silent, even the band in the distance, even the nighttime noises such as crickets and animals. All of it instantly faded. It was like a blanket covered our world. We both turned our heads simultaneously to look down the path we had been walking on, and there, standing in the middle of the path ahead of us, was nothing. We could clearly see that something was supposed to be there, but the only way I had ever been able to describe what we saw was a 7-foot-tall void. No dark shadows, no physical form, just nothing. From that nothing came the very real sense that we were not welcome here. I could feel this thing getting angrier by the second, so finally, I leaned over to Victoria and asked her, "You see that too, right?" "Yeah," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "We need to leave." To our credit, we didn't run. She and I simply turned around and began to walk back the way we came. After we walked for about 10 minutes, we were only 20 meters away from the head of the trail, and we could see the light of the yard lamps in front of the house, when Victoria stopped suddenly. I turned to look at her. She was hunched over, her whole body convulsing as she mumbled under her breath. I didn't look back up the path to see if the thing had followed us. I instead focused on my friend. "Victoria, what's wrong?" I asked again, putting my arms around her shoulders to try and pull her forward. If you've ever dunked your arm into an icy pool in the middle of winter, you have some idea of what the air felt like at the back of Victoria's neck. She panicked and thrashed a bit as I yanked my arm back. Don't. He doesn't want me to leave again," she said, shivering and crying. Determined, I reached over her again and tried to pull her. Victoria was a tiny thing, barely $120, and I, being much taller and stronger, could have easily moved her on any given day. Except that night, Victoria didn't budge. She didn't stumble or even lean forward. I may as well have been trying to move the oak tree next to us. She cried out again, and I removed my arm. "He's angry," she said, before she started mumbling to herself again. I stood there, unable to help as my friend tried to free herself. Feeling at a loss, I simply stood next to her, pressing my arm against hers and trying to give her whatever support she needed. When I did that, I could feel a looming pressure at my back, that cold and icy feeling slithering down my spine like cold acid. But I refused to move. After what seemed like an eternity, Victoria stumbled forward, almost as if she had been pushed, and I jumped into action. I grabbed her arm and steadied her as we ran the remaining distance to the head of the trail. Once we were out under the stars, we relaxed a bit and slowed to a fast walk as we made our way back to her yard and the safety of home. Victoria was so out of breath and exhausted, she looked as though she had run a marathon. Whatever it was had sapped her of her strength. Curious, I glanced back into the woods, and to this day, part of me wishes I hadn't. Behind us, about 10 paces back, hovered a tall column of smoke. In it were tendrils of red that danced like fire. I could barely make out a face in the smoke, a face that glared at me and shook me to my core. I stared for a moment, unsure if the thing was going to attack or not. I managed to turn and began to bustle my friend back into her yard even more quickly. I tried to take her into the house, but she refused and instead ran to her car. Once we were both inside, she grabbed her rosary that her grandfather had given her and began to pray. I looked back beyond the yard, but the spirit was gone. Thankfully, Victoria calmed down. She explained that her grandfather had been a priest and an exorcist. When she was little, she'd had issues with the spirits in the woods. In order to protect her, her grandfather blessed their property and told her to stay out of the woods. And until now, she had. Fast forward about 10 years, and I find myself sitting in a car outside those same woods. I had told some of my friends about the encounter, and they were eager to have an experience of their own. I, though, was reluctant to go back. I hadn't been back in these particular woods since the incident, despite spending a lot of time on the property and growing close to her family. When we parked, I got out of the car and froze. That same feeling of, "you're not welcome here," hit me like a ton of bricks, and I stared at the head of the trail Victoria and I had taken so long ago. It was black, pitch black, and off in the distance I could hear the thud-like booming sound of what I can only assume were drums. I got back into my car, made a fool of myself in a panic, and happily watched the tree line fade away in our taillights while my friends grumbled in the front seat, having been denied their adventure. I didn't care. I'd gotten the distinct feeling that this time, the spirit in those woods would not be as merciful. I don't mind the forest. I love the trees and the sounds and smells and the energy overall. But I also know where I'm not welcome, and I will never go back into those woods, aside from the danger of sinkholes and mud traps and dangerous undertows in the river. There are lingering forces that we cannot begin to comprehend, forces that lurk just beyond our senses. Sometimes they're happy for the company you bring, and other times they'd rather you leave and never come back. Number 3. The Whistle in the Forest. Submitted by Ash 5000. One day, me and a friend of mine went through a forest to some swings near my house. It was something to do since I was usually bored at home at this time and had no life. But anyway, we got to the swings. We swung and chatted for a long time, when out of nowhere, we heard something I can only describe as a scream-like whistling. My friend is the type of person who gets scared easily, but I told her it's just some sort of weird bird. She tried to calm down, but then we heard another whistle closer to us. By then, she said she was ready to go. I said no, it was just her mind playing tricks, and I said that I wouldn't let anything happen to her. But she persisted, and eventually we decided to go home. We weren't even halfway through the woods, and then there it was, another creepy whistle. This time, it was deafening, because it was much, much closer. That's when we started running. The whistling sounded again, and every time it drew closer, no matter how fast we went. We luckily made it out of the forest, and that's when the whistling stopped. The moment we set foot out of those trees. We felt comfortable enough to walk, though we were basically panting by then. We looked at each other, and I asked, "What do you think that whistling was?" And she said, "That didn't sound like a whistle to me. It sounded like someone screaming right in my ear." I don't know if she heard something differently because she was so scared, or if it appeared differently to both of us for some reason. I just want to know what it was that was following us, what it was that wanted us out of those woods so bad. Number 4. Driving in the Forest. Submitted by Ozymandias 111. I was about 21 at the time, and I was in the Navy. I got leave for a while around Christmas, so I went back to my hometown in northwest Louisiana, right next to the border of Arkansas. A few days in, I decided to visit my friend's house in Arkansas. He lived across from a lake that was part of a national forest. I drove to his house around 9 p.m. in my old Chevy S10. I drove through the woods and around the lake to his home. We started drinking and catching up on things that had happened since I went to boot camp. Around 1 in the morning, I was drunk, and I decided I should drive home. Yeah, that's a bad idea. But I didn't say I was the smartest person. When I was driving, I got past the lake and into the forest, and I started swerving and decided that I should stop and just sleep it off. I got past this spillway and I turned onto the dirt road. I got to a place that seemed to be an old oil rig or something like that. I pulled in the opening and turned my truck to where it was facing the road, woods completely surrounding everything. I locked the doors just in case. I was thinking I was in the middle of the forest at night, so no one should drive past me or anything like that. So I laid down on my seat and went to sleep. I woke up not long after with a very bad feeling. I sat up and turned on my light, shining it on the forest, when I saw what appeared to be a man, but everything was black. Every inch of him was completely black, blacker than the night that surrounded him. The figure stopped in front of my truck. My light had absolutely no effect on him. He remained just as dark as before. He looked at me, or at least I think it was looking at me. Then it walked into the other side of the road, back into the tree line. I noped the heck out of there and drove all the way back to my grandmother's house, almost offing myself in my drunken stupor the whole time. I don't know what it was that I saw in the middle of the forest that night. I probably never will. I'm out of the Navy now, and sometimes I drive down that road, but every time I do, I get a feeling that someone is watching me. And number 5, The Lonely Piper, submitted by Dutch Scout 13. I'm a Dutch Boy Scout and a big WW2 geek and reenactor. I reenact the 15th Scottish Division. My friends don't get why I'm interested in it so much, but I don't mind. They always hold a summer camp during summer vacation, and last year in 2016 we went to Belgium, near the city of Brugge, by train. I had a great time there, but one thing happened that I found strange, and I'm still terrified of it today. We arrived at the station around 12 o'clock in the afternoon. Our campsite wasn't ready yet, so my friends and I went to check out the village near our campsite. We were walking around looking at stores when we stumbled upon a trail that led to a cemetery in the woods. It was morbidly beautiful. I heard that some Scottish soldiers had been buried there, so I went over to take a look. One of the graves was very special. It said, "The Lonely Piper, 1923 to 1944. I thought that soldier must have been playing the bagpipe during battle. There was this old man sitting on a bench near one of the graves. He called me over and told me, "You should leave these graves alone, otherwise he will come out and get you." A stranger suddenly saying that in such a serious tone of voice, it was enough to cringe and creep me out. I didn't know what to say, so I just said nothing. That night at the campsite, we were sitting around the campfire, chatting and telling stories to each other. One of the group leaders called us and said that we're going to do some games in the forest that night. I, being rather tired, went to our tent with a friend of mine to get some rest. We had been planning to stay up all night, and eventually that would happen, but I needed a bit of shut-eye first. Before then, my friend and I were chatting about, when all of a sudden, we hear the sound of bagpipes being played rather loudly near our tent. We at first thought our friends were playing tricks on us, so I opened the tent door, only to see a man standing eerily still near the fire. He was wearing a dirty kilt and a British Army battle dress or tunic. My friend said, "What is it?" I didn't know what to say to him. Luckily, the piper wasn't looking at me, so I tried to slowly close the tent door, until his face began to point in my direction, slowly. He appeared normal at first, healthy even, but when he was fully facing me, I could see a part of his skull, like it had partially rotted away under the ground after so many years, like a zombie. I was speechless, but he, as weird as it might sound, he wasn't. He kindly said hello in a typical Scottish accent. I stuttered a hello, but he turned around and marched away, playing his bagpipe. My friend didn't believe me at first, but when the others came back from the forest, saying that they heard someone playing a bagpipe, well, everyone believed after that. This was a weird experience for me, and I'm still thinking about what he would have done to me if he wasn't so kind. When people and animals alike prowl the forest, causing death and chaos in their wake, you better believe that many forests can become haunting grounds, places where spirits and creatures are restless, where the supernatural and paranormal take hold, where you don't want to find yourself getting lost, because then you probably won't make it out. Good night. Be sure to like, share, comment, and subscribe if you enjoyed the video. Remember, you can share your true scary stories with me using the links in the description, and check out morbidmonsters.com for some awesome and cheap shirts that support this channel and represent. Thank you all for listening. Stay safe out there, and stay creepy.